Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching Gravitas. My name is Molly Gambhir. Lots lined up. Let's get started.
Specifically in India's case, it's the world's largest democracy, it's the fifth largest economy, it's the biggest contributor to the UN peacekeeping forces. Do you believe it's time that countries like India got their rightful place?
Who gets what has to be decided by the membership.
Current constitution of the United Nations, especially the Security Council, should reflect the changed world order.
Realities on the ground should be reflective in the Security Council.
Agencies like the World Health Organization that took very long, some say, to declare a pandemic and have still not held China accountable.
WHO is trying its best, but no one has been able to meet the expectations.
Did the Myanmar representative make an address at the UNGA?
There was no request by the Myanmar delegation to speak.
The only thing constant in life is change. To stay relevant, you need to adapt to the changing times. These phrases hold true today more than ever. With the ever-changing geopolitics, alliances being reshaped around the world is not the same as it was in 1945. But the UN Security Council has hardly changed ever since. No surprises then that it is facing a crisis of relevance. The UN General Assembly has debated council reforms, but there has been no consensus. The fact of the matter is the UN needs to change to keep up with the times. Power can no longer stay concentrated within a few. Reforms are required to build a more effective global institution, a more democratic one. The Afghanistan crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, to name a few, have served as urgent reminders of the need for these reforms. In the latest, Myanmar and Afghanistan were denied a platform to speak at the UNGA. Tonight on Gravitas, we get you an exclusive interview with the President of the United Nations General Assembly, Abdulla Shahid, who spoke to WION's Executive Editor Palki Sharma Upadhyay on the reforms agenda at the United Nations and whether countries like India will get their rightful place in the Security Council. My name is Molly Gambhir. Also on the show for you tonight, the Evergrande Crisis has been dubbed as China's Lehman moment, but with the crisis now spreading, things could get worse than 2008. We also tell you all about China's bursting housing bubble. With a crucial bill stuck, a US government shutdown could be on the horizon. We tell you what that could mean and how things reached this point. The UK fuel crisis continues to rage. The army is now on standby. We get to the latest. Can the Taliban get 150 nuclear weapons? America's former National Security Advisor John Bolton believes the terror group could get its hands on Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. We get you a special report. First, as always, Gravitas Global Headlines.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin testifies before a Senate panel on Afghanistan. Austin says tragically 10 innocent lives were taken during a drone strike. He says shocked to see U.S.-trained Afghan army melt away. The Taliban make their first diplomatic appointment with its foreign ministry, saying that Hafiz Mohibullah has been appointed as the first secretary of the Afghan embassy in Islamabad. The Taliban request Pakistan to accept the appointment. Afghanistan will use the constitution of the times of the nation's last king, Mohammad Zafir Shah, who reigned from the years 1933 to 1973, except provisions which contradict the Sharia law. The head of Angela Merkel's sister party says that Olaf Scholz, the candidate from the Social Democratic Party in Germany, has the best chance to become the German chancellor. China strongly condemns Britain for sailing a warship through the sensitive Taiwan Strait. Beijing says that the act harbored evil intentions. China adds that its military followed the HMS Richmond vessel and warned it away. South Korea's military says that North Korea fired a missile towards the sea off its east coast. The launch came shortly before Pyongyang's representative told the United Nations that the nation has the right to test weapons because of hostile policies directed against it. A severe power crunch jolts China as the country faces mounting pressure to ramp up its coal imports to keep the lights on. Electricity shortages cripple factories in the world's second-largest economy. The governor of the hard-hit Jilin province calls for a surge in coal import. In a Reuters interview, Pakistan's envoy to Kabul, Manzoor Ahmad Khan, says that Pakistan has discussed Taliban-led Afghanistan joining the multi-billion-dollar China-Pakistan economic corridor. The envoy says that regional connectivity is an important element of Pakistan's discussion with the Taliban. Google blasted EU antitrust regulators for ignoring rival Apple as it launched a bid to get Europe's second highest court to annul a record $5.1 billion fine, a fine related to its Android operating system. According to new tough rules, tech giants like Google, Apple, Amazon and Facebook will have to adapt their business models for a level playing field for rivals. England captain Joe Root says he is desperate to take part in the Ashes, but has not confirmed his spot in the touring party. Strict travel and quarantine regulations in Australia have caused many England players to mull a boycott. The England Cricket Board are set to present the touring conditions, and players will have to decide by next week whether they will make themselves available for selection. American gymnastics icon Simone Biles has said that she should have quit the sport well in advance of the Tokyo Olympic Games. The 24-year-old withdrew from 5 of her 6 finals in Japan, citing mental health reasons. She had spoken in 2018 about being sexually abused by now convicted U.S. team doctor Larry Nassar, and reiterated that she is still dealing with the ordeal.
Last night, we told you how pro-democracy voices were denied a chance to speak at the United Nations. Myanmar's representative to the United Nations, Ko Motun, did not deliver an address to the General Assembly. The same diplomat who had displayed the 3-finger sign inside the UN as a mark of protest against the Myanmar military, he bravely defied the military junta, but he could not get a chance to speak. Even Afghanistan's diplomat had to withdraw in a similar fashion. Why were these 2 diplomats denied a platform? To put it briefly, politics prevailed. The United Nations says democracy is a core value of the institution, but as long as real power stays concentrated within the hands of a few, the UN will struggle to uphold the same values. So when will this change? What is happening to the reforms agenda at the United Nations? Will countries like India get their rightful place in the Security Council? Why was Myanmar denied a chance to speak? Have United Nations agencies lost the trust of the people? And what about China's growing influence within the UN? Last evening, WION's executive editor, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, put these questions to the UN General Assembly President, Abdulla Shahid. Here is an excerpt from that conversation.
Hello and welcome to WION's Global Leadership Series. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay, and today's interview is special. I say this because with me is not a head of state or government. With me is a leader who heads the world's biggest multilateral organization. The President of the United Nations General Assembly, Abdulla Shahid. Mr. President, welcome to WION.
My pleasure.
I want to start with by reiterating what the Prime Minister of India said, that your presidency is a matter of pride for the developing world. I also want to add that it comes with a lot of expectations from developing countries like India. Mr. President, do you have a list of things that you want to achieve during your tenure?
I came to the UN General Assembly presidency promising a presidency of hope. Given the despair, death and devastation that we have seen world around during the last 18 months, I believed that we needed to lift humanity from the conundrum of a spiral of downward depression. That is why I wanted to bring in a presidency of hope. And the presidency of hope is based on 5 rays of hope: responding to COVID-19, rebuilding sustainably, recovering from the needs for the planet, respecting the rights of all, and reforming the United Nations.
Right, that seems like an exhaustive agenda, and there's one ray of hope in particular that I'm going to focus on, and that is reform of the United Nations. How much progress has that made?
Well, we have just started the debate. Reform of the United Nations have 2 basic components: revitalizing the work of the General Assembly and reforming the Security Council of the United Nations. Both the items are membership driven, and I am hoping that given the need for substantial progress in sending a message of confidence to the constituents, we need to make some progress on this, and the membership would come up doing that.
In your consultations with world leaders, do you believe that there is consensus on the need to reform and on the need to have more countries as permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, countries like India?
Well, there is definitely a consensus being built on the need for reform. I do not think that there is any dispute on whether to reform or not. It is how to reform, the question is. And for that, definitely we will have to get the membership to proceed with the consultations that they are carrying out.
Specifically on India's case, it's the world's largest democracy, it's the 5th largest economy, it's the biggest contributor to the UN peacekeeping forces, and yet India is out of permanent membership of the Security Council. Do you believe it's time that countries like India got their rightful place?
Who gets what has to be decided by the membership. It is not the President of the General Assembly to comment on this, because there is an ongoing process, and I should give room for this consultation to proceed.
But you agree that it's been 7 decades since the United Nations was formed, and the world order has changed, and the current constitution of the United Nations, especially the Security Council, should reflect the changed world order?
For the Security Council to have credibility, the realities on the ground should be reflective in the Security Council, and that is very clearly seen in how we are dealing with these situations.
Interesting that you bring up the subject of credibility, and many critics say that the UN's credibility has taken a beating in the last couple of years in the response to the pandemic and the failure, quote unquote, of multilateral organizations like the United Nations to effectively respond. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do not. I think that the multilateral organizations such as the United Nations have been responding. Of course, during this pandemic, this is a pandemic which has hit the entire humanity with such force that we have all been unprepared. But during these 18 months, the United Nations continued to function virtually. At the initial stage, I have been able to bring the United Nations back into in-person in a hybrid format. So we are responding, but yes, not to the expectation of the constituents, we the peoples.
No, I must congratulate you for the way the United Nations General Assembly was finally convened, and a lot of leaders flew into the US to participate in person, and many others participated virtually. I'm talking about the response to the pandemic and agencies like the World Health Organization that took very long, some say, to declare a pandemic and have still not held China accountable. And the bias that Dr. Tedros has been accused of towards China still remains a point of concern for many. How do you expect the world to take UN and its agencies seriously and see them as part of the solution if these questions remain?
Humanity has been able to come up with a vaccine in record time. This has never been seen. We have launched a vaccination program worldwide, so wide that this is something that we have never seen. But yes, it is still not up to the expectation, and it is not enough. More needs to be done. That everyone has agreed.
But you've not commented on the role of the WHO.
WHO is trying its best, and I think as President of the General Assembly, I salute the work that they have been doing under very difficult circumstances. But none of us, none of the organizations, none of the national governments, no one has been able to meet the expectations, and that is agreed.
Why do you think that is the case?
Because we have been hit so hard, that none of us were prepared. We have to be prepared for the next pandemic.
Is it just the pandemic, or is it also politics that has hampered the functioning of the United Nations and its agencies?
What we have come to know through this pandemic is that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Now, this is synonym for multilateralism. We have to, in our heart, believe that we are so interconnected. And we had seen through a pandemic, this small virus has shown us that we can't continue arguing. We have to come together. Unity is the only strength that will save us, and multilateralism is the only way to go forward.
But unity on whose terms is the question, sir? We saw in the case of Myanmar, 3 countries decided that the representative of Myanmar will not speak at the UNGA, and that was the decision that was followed. What happens to the United Nations Security Council?
I am sorry that no country has decided that Myanmar will not speak. We have rules of procedures here, and the rules of procedures are being followed. There is a committee on the credentials, and they are meeting in November, and their report will be adopted by the General Assembly. So it is up to the membership of the United Nations to decide on these things.
But the member was not allowed to address the Assembly.
I am not aware of it. As President, I am not aware of anyone not allowing. I am the person who will either allow or not allow.
Did the Myanmar representative make an address at the UNGA?
There was no request by the Myanmar delegation to speak.
The mission of the United Nations, from what I understand, is peace, dignity and equality on a healthy planet. As things stand today, peace is being threatened by some countries which follow an expansionist agenda, especially in South China Sea. Dignity and equality are under threat because of certain policies within those countries, like what's happening in Xinjiang. And we are in the middle of a health crisis, courtesy a pandemic that originated in China. Would you say that countries like China pose a threat?
As the President, it is my job to unify the membership. So it will be highly, highly unfair for me to comment on a question to brand a country either way or not.
I understand. As the President of the General Assembly, does it bother you that countries which have a very poor domestic record on human rights end up on the United Nations Human Rights Council?
The United Nations Human Rights Council is an elected body. It's up to the members to elect them, and therefore the President has no role in either way the members vote.
Is this in essence the biggest challenge for the United Nations, that while there are rules, while there are members, while there is this entire paraphernalia, a lot of the decisions made are non-binding, that the bureaucracy overtakes the actual purpose?
The United Nations is run, first and foremost, guided by the Charter of the United Nations, which brings every country, all the countries together. And that's what the General Assembly does. And that is why the General Assembly gives each and every country one vote, irrespective of size, irrespective of power, wealth, whatever. Each country has one vote. And that proves to the world the message that comes from the General Assembly. The power of the General Assembly is the moral authority of the majority of the countries. And that's what it is. And that is what multilateralism is all about. It is not about one country against the other. It is about all the countries coming together.
So then we come back to the question of the relevance of the United Nations. And as President, sir, how are you trying to bring various countries and members together to impress upon them that this system is not going to be effective and will be rendered irrelevant unless these things are changed?
Dialogue, consultations, face-to-face meetings, which would hopefully avoid conflict. And it has in the past proven that it is always better to have the option of dialogue, consultation and conversation.
Do you think that the countries that really pushed for climate action are themselves doing their bit? Countries like India, for instance, have met their Paris goals, and we're looking at a COP summit later. But do you believe that the developed world is doing enough to counter climate change?
In 1987, when the Maldives started talking about sea level rise, it was not the fashionable thing. In fact, some of the larger countries, they couldn't understand even whether, what's this sea level rise thing? It was not received. It was before this, the whole issue became fashionable. And at that time, and the decades that followed, it was the view of many that, okay, the small island countries will go underwater, and then people will move on to high ground, and we'll be there. But no, it didn't happen that way. This is not affecting just one group of people. It's affecting the entire planet. So we should stop talking about who does what. We should start talking, what can I do? So I ask everyone in every country to stand up, ask their governments to do their bit, because we are on the cliff. Before we fall, let's do it. That is what COP26 is about.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I know it's been a long day for you, a long week for you, but you sat down with us to take our questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And you can catch that entire conversation tonight at 10:30 p.m. IST, that's 5 p.m. GMT. Meanwhile, in China, the debt crisis at Evergrande is only snowballing. Thousands of investors have lost money. Let's get you up to speed with the latest. Reportedly, the company has missed multiple payments. So far, at least 70,000 retail investors have suffered losses as a result. Needless to say, they want their money back. The defaults are now also hitting trusts. Reports say some of them had to dip into their own pockets to pay back the wealthy investors. If Evergrande remains on the same trajectory, millions will suffer. Remember, 1.6 million people bought apartments from Evergrande. They paid for their homes, but the company is yet to deliver them. More than 80,000 people purchased Evergrande's retail finance products. These citizens were asked to invest their money with Evergrande. They may not get their money back. Evergrande's list of creditors does not end there. The company even strong-armed its own employees to raise money. Tens of thousands of employees were given a choice. If they wanted to keep their bonuses, they had to give Evergrande a short-term loan, and they complied. Now even Evergrande's employees are not sure if they will be paid or not. And they are not the only ones who are living in uncertainty. Suppliers who worked with Evergrande are yet to be paid as well. Rohui is one of them. He was a supplier for Evergrande. Now he is forced to sell his car and apartment just to keep his business going because Evergrande is yet to settle his bills.
I can tell you from the bottom of my heart, I haven't had a good night's sleep since June. We also visited the Evergrande headquarters in Shenzhen when the news media were covering at that time. We were actually there as well. We went to their headquarters to discuss about repayments. We also asked for help from the government's petition department. What we can do now is just trust the government will help us to solve it. But I have also prepared for the worst possible scenario, which is the company going bankrupt.
For 2 weeks, we have been telling you this story is not about one struggling real estate developer. It is about the real estate bubble of China. The bubble was inflated by debt, money that Chinese developers cannot pay back now. The Evergrande crisis has popped the same bubble. Another real estate player in China could be facing a debt crisis. The name of the company is Sunac. A letter linked to the company went viral on social media. It said the company wants special policy support from a local government. Let me now quote from it. We earnestly request the government to provide us with special policy support as it is difficult for daily operations in Shaoxing to move forward and the situation is deteriorating daily. Why is Sunac struggling now? The reason is the same, just like Evergrande. People are not buying properties in Sunac projects. The sales are slow, demand has dropped. Earlier today, the company issued a clarification. It said the letter was a draft note. It wasn't supposed to go out. Sunac may be able to tide through these difficult times, but what about the other embattled property developers of China? You see, Evergrande is not an isolated case. The entire real estate market in China is a disaster waiting to happen, a housing bubble of epic proportions. If this sector collapses, it could take the entire Chinese economy with it. Our next report tells you how China missed the warning signs and what this could mean for the global economy.
Wide empty roads, deserted intersections and unoccupied towers. These are the ghost cities of China, built for a middle class that never came. Construction was considered the engine of China's growth. Local Communist Party officials lured developers into their towns. They had just one rule: start building ASAP. Chinese developers obliged. They borrowed billions of dollars and built tens of thousands of apartments. When city limits ended, they expanded beyond into the outskirts and rural China. But the occupants never came. It is a story of two Chinas. In big cities, homes are hard to find and even harder to buy. That's how expensive they are. But once you leave the cities, you will find acres of real estate empty and forgotten. The two Chinas have one thing in common though: debt. Property prices in cities were clearly inflated. But the banks didn't seem to mind. They kept sanctioning loans for overpriced homes. Same for developers. Bank loans funded their massive construction spree, their ghost towns and their empty towers. And the problem with loans? Well, interest. The Chinese government was concerned about the rising ratio of debt. So they did what they do best: a clampdown on borrowing. This triggered a chain reaction in the housing market. No loans means no buyers. And no buyers means no business. Chinese developers started running out of cash. They didn't have money to pay the banks. What we described is a classic housing bubble. The signs were always there, but China chose to ignore them. Sign number 1, the rate of construction. China was building 5 times as many houses as America and Europe combined. The result? Around 50 to 64 million empty apartments. Assuming 3 people per house, that's more than 150 million potential occupants. You could fit entire countries in China's empty houses. Sign number 2, the inflated housing market. In Shenzhen, condos are selling for 57 times the average national income. In Beijing, 55 times. Simply put, buying a house was becoming impossible. So what does this mean for the Chinese economy? Major trouble. Real estate is the cornerstone of the Chinese economy. It makes up 30% of the GDP and 78% of all Chinese assets. So if real estate collapses, it will take the Chinese economy with it. And things seem to be moving in that direction. This year, 220 real estate companies have filed for bankruptcy. Bad loans in the property sector are surging. A 53.5% rise at the Bank of Jinsao and 25.8% at the Bank of Shanghai. Turns out real estate wasn't the engine of China's growth. It was their Great Wall of Debt. And unlike the Great Wall of China, this one is crumbling. We still don't know the real extent of this bubble. How many commercial banks are exposed? How many multinationals depend on Evergrande and Company? It is being called China's Lehman moment, but this crash could make 2008 look timid. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Shifting focus now to the United States, where fears of a shutdown are on the rise. A crucial bill which funds the American government has been blocked in the American Senate. But why exactly was the bill blocked, and is a shutdown on the horizon? If yes, how will it impact the government's functioning? We break it down for you. Let's start with the basics. On the 30th of September, America's fiscal year will end, which basically means the government will be running out of funds and will need a new spending measure. With just 2 days left for the fiscal year to end, no new funds have been appropriated. Why is that? Because American lawmakers are busy quarreling. There are differences within the US Congress over the nature of funds that should be allocated, something that has become a ritual now. But this time, things are looking pretty serious. Last week, the US House of Representatives, where the Democrats have a thin majority, passed a measure to keep the government functional. They raised the debt limit by a vote of 220 to 211. For the uninitiated, the debt limit is a cap on the total amount of money that the federal government is allowed to borrow in order to fulfill its financial obligations. The Democrats voted to raise the debt limit. The Republicans voted to sustain it. The bill passed the House nonetheless. On Monday, the bill reached the US Senate, the upper house of the US Congress. Here, it was blocked by the Republicans. The senators voted 50 to 48 against the bill. This was way short of the 60 votes it needed to pass through. The voting process was marked by a showdown. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and the Minority Leader Mitch McConnell had a heated exchange. Schumer accused the Republicans of settling political points, while McConnell accused the Democrats of moving towards permanent socialism.
There's no scenario in God's green earth where it should be worth risking millions of jobs, trillions in household wealth, people's social security checks, veterans' benefits, and another recession just to score short-term, meaningless political points. That's what Republicans seem fixated on doing.
Democrats want to use this temporary pandemic as a Trojan horse for permanent socialism. They've all but said so. And that is what millions and millions of Americans elected 50 Republican senators to fight against.
So now that the bill has been blocked, what happens next? The Democrats say they will keep fighting, that they will try again to get the bill passed. But with the fiscal year about to end and Republicans hell-bent on blocking the bill, their chances look bleak. Time is not on their side. 2 days are all that they have. On Thursday midnight, funding for most federal agencies will expire. Several functions will come to a grinding halt. This will be the second such shutdown in 3 years if it happens. The last time it happened, some 800,000 workers missed at least 2 paychecks and went without pay for 35 days straight. This shattered the previous record of 21 days in 1996. Veterans lost access to care, essential workers were sent on leaves, airports faced delays, there were labor shortages. So is America headed for a repeat of this nightmare? Will it be the same this time around? Well, observers say it will be. Every essential service could be impacted, from healthcare to transport, defense, housing, postal services, scientific institutions. All of them could suffer. And given that the shutdown will happen during a pandemic, could make matters worse. But can it be avoided? Only if the Republicans and the Democrats arrive at a consensus, which looks difficult as of now. One way would be for the Republicans to agree on raising the cap on federal borrowing. Another way would be for the Democrats to drop the increase in debt limit. Only then could this deadlock end. Until then, a shutdown is all but imminent. Meanwhile, the Taliban's return has invigorated terror groups around the world, especially in Pakistan. Many of them share the Taliban's ambition to topple the national government. But there is a key difference between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are nuclear weapons in Pakistan. So a terrorist takeover could mean a new threat for the world. Nuclear terrorism. America's former National Security Advisor John Bolton believes Pakistan's nuclear arsenal is now vulnerable. Our next report tells you more.
November 10th, 2001, Pakistani newspaper Dawn carried this ominous headline. Osama claims he has nukes. The Al-Qaeda chief never hid his nuclear ambitions. In 1998, he said that acquiring nuclear weapons was his Islamic duty, one that he never fulfilled. Al-Qaeda never got their hands on WMDs, and the world was spared the threat of nuclear terrorism. But 20 years later, those fears have re-emerged. The Taliban are back in Kabul. Other terror groups are looking to replicate this success. Their target? Pakistan's nuclear stockpile. The biggest threat is the TTP, or Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. They are basically a sister group of the Afghan Taliban with the same sinister agenda: to topple the government. The TTP is waging an armed struggle against the Pakistani state. They want to overthrow the government in Islamabad. Last month, 52 Pakistani security personnel were killed in TTP attacks. The Taliban's return has invigorated them. So the question is, can they beat the Pakistani military? Can they overrun Islamabad? America's top security expert John Bolton certainly thinks so. Here's what he says. The Taliban is in control of Afghanistan, threatens the possibility of terrorists taking control of Pakistan. That means maybe 150 nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists. This possibility has long worried the world. Reports say Pakistan has nearly 165 nuclear warheads, 15 more than John Bolton's estimate. What happens to these nukes if terrorists topple the government? This is why the world keeps giving Pakistan multiple chances, not out of love, but fear. The fear of nuclear terrorism. For India, this could mean an existential threat. Terror groups in Pakistan have targeted India for years. Imagine them with nuclear weapons. They don't understand deterrence or restraint. Meanwhile, the Taliban are busy turning back the clock. On Tuesday, they adopted a constitution. It is 57 years old. The same constitution that was implemented in 1964 during Mohammad Zahir Shah's rule. But not every rule will apply. Anything that violates the Sharia or the Taliban's principles will be removed. This raises questions on women's voting rights. The 1964 constitution permitted women to vote. Will the Taliban keep this rule? We may never know the answer, because this constitution is supposed to be temporary, a stopgap, until the Taliban unveil their grand agenda. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
And what about the country that put Afghanistan in this mess in the first place? The United States, what are they up to? The US Congress has been grilling America's top military leaders. A few big admissions have been made. Let me take you through some of them. Number one, the Pentagon says the Taliban was and is a terror group. This raises questions about America's ties with the Taliban. Have they ruled out diplomatic recognition? What happens to the fight against ISIS Khorasan? No clarity there. Number two, the Taliban have not broken their ties with the Al-Qaeda. Again, that's a very crucial admission. The 2020 Doha Agreement, remember, had specifically asked the Taliban to sever ties with the Al-Qaeda. And now the Pentagon says those links are intact. Plus, the Al-Qaeda is growing. Pentagon leaders admitted that the threat of a reconstituted Al-Qaeda is very real. They also hinted at the possibility of more attacks by Al-Qaeda and the ISIS Khorasan. That, of course, makes you question the entire objective of America's mission. Joe Biden claimed that the Al-Qaeda has been decimated. Clearly, his generals disagree with him. Number three, the Pentagon wanted to retain a small military presence in Afghanistan. General Mark Milley proposed keeping 2,500 troops. He submitted this proposal to President Joe Biden, but it was rejected. Number four, the Pentagon chief, Lloyd Austin, admitted America's ignorance on the ground situation in Afghanistan, whether it was corruption or poor leadership. He says the US did not comprehend these realities. Again, not true. Corruption in Afghanistan was widely reported by American media, no less. It's simply impossible that the Pentagon was unaware of these reports. Number five, a divide within the Pentagon. General Milley admitted that US credibility has taken a hit. He says allies are reviewing their ties with America. Lloyd Austin, the general, may have agreed, but not Austin, the politician. The Secretary of Defense maintains that America's credibility is solid. But he did admit one key failure, the US drone strike that killed 10 innocent people in Kabul. Take a look at some of the top moments from that hearing.
We helped build a state, Mr. Chairman, but we could not forge a nation. The fact that the Afghan army that we and our partners trained simply melted away, in many cases without firing a shot, took us all by surprise, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. We need to consider some uncomfortable truths. That we didn't fully comprehend the depth of corruption and poor leadership in the senior ranks. That we didn't grasp the damaging effect of frequent and unexplained rotations by President Ghani of his commanders. That we didn't anticipate the snowball effect caused by the deals that the Taliban commanders struck with local leaders in the wake of the Doha Agreement. And that the Doha Agreement itself had a demoralizing effect on Afghan soldiers.
We must remember that the Taliban was and remains a terrorist organization, and they still have not broken ties with Al-Qaeda. I have no illusions who we are dealing with. It remains to be seen whether or not the Taliban can consolidate power or if the country will further fracture into civil war. But we must continue to protect the United States of America and its people from terrorist attacks coming from Afghanistan. A reconstituted al-Qaeda or ISIS with aspirations to attack the United States is a very real possibility. And those conditions, to include activity in ungoverned spaces, could present themselves in the next 12 to 36 months.
There was also an interesting interaction between Senator Tom Cotton and the two military leaders. It seems there was some sort of delay in relaying military advice to President Joe Biden. You have to listen to this.
General Milley, Joe Biden has said that it was the unanimous recommendation of the Joint Chiefs that we not maintain a military presence beyond August 31st. We've heard testimony to that effect today as well. When was that unanimous recommendation sought and presented to the President?
You're talking about the 31 August?
Yes, the 31 August deadline for getting out of here.
So on 25 August, I was asked to make an assessment and provide best military advice on...
I'm sorry, my time is limited here. You gave me the answer that I needed to hear. August 25th?
That's correct.
Kabul fell on August 15th.
That's correct.
You were not asked before August 25th?
16th. On August 25th, I was asked to provide best military assessment as whether we should keep military forces past the 31st.
Secretary Austin, was anybody asked before August 25th if we should keep troops at the Kabul airport?
This is the president tasked us to provide an assessment on whether or not we should extend our presence beyond August 31st. And as General Milley just said, that assessment was made. We tasked him to make that assessment on the 25th, and he came back and provided his best military advice.
Secretary, Kabul fell on August 15th. It was clear that we had thousands of Americans. It was clear to members of this committee who were getting phone calls that we had thousands of Americans in Afghanistan behind Taliban lines on August 15th. And it took 10 days to ask these general officers if we should extend our presence. I suspect the answer might be a little different if you were asking them 16 days out, not 5 days out.
On that note, it's a wrap on this edition, leaving you with Gravitas Images. Thanks very much for watching.